Well, new tonight, the largest health insurance provider in the state is warning of layoffs. Today, a Louisiana Blue Cross Blue Shield spokesperson confirmed the company is looking to cut jobs at several of its locations across the state. That representative did not say how many people would be laid off, but they currently employ about 3,000 people here in Louisiana. The company blamed expiring subsidies from the Affordable Care Act. Louisiana Workforce Commission says it has not gotten any notices from Blue Cross. The company would be required to tell the Workforce Commission if they fire more than 50 people in 1 month. And as the state of Texas attempts to redistrict its congressional seats, it could bring larger implications to Louisiana and the nation. Here's more of what you need to know as next year's midterm elections are quickly approaching. Last week, over 50 Democratic representatives left the Texas House to hold consideration of a mid-decade redistricting map. That map seeks to add 5 more Republican seats to the congressional delegation. Now, tensions are rising over lawmakers who left the state and broke quorum in the Texas House during a special session.
There's a lot of attention right now in Texas, in California. I think you're going to see other states, both red and blue, making decisions on whether or not they want to do these mid-decade adjustments to their congressional districting, with the idea that it could swing the midterm elections one way or the other.
The move could bring implications to Louisiana's current congressional map, which is currently under the microscope in the U.S. Supreme Court. Democratic Congressman Cleo Fields' Congressional District 6 faces a lawsuit from non-black voters over creating a second majority black district. A Supreme Court order calls for both parties in the suit to find if this map violates the U.S. Constitution.
And I think ultimately the Supreme Court will rule that the district will stand.
There won't be any ruling on Louisiana's maps until the spring, but it will entail whether the state violated the 14th and 15th Amendments, respectively. LaRose says those amendments set up the right to vote for the formerly enslaved and protect that right.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 essentially put teeth, added protections to the 14th and 15th Amendments that make it illegal to pass any laws or create a procedure that would interfere with those voting rights.
However, since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which became law 60 years ago this week, LaRose says the act has been weakened by previous Supreme Court decisions, with the concern that if the justices decide that Louisiana's second black congressional district was an illegal racial gerrymander,
then I think that has a ripple effect impacting everything you see going on right now in Texas, California, and other states.
Congressman Fields argues politics, not race, influenced Louisiana's map design. However, he's also raising concerns about Texas's redistricting fight, as Governor Greg Abbott threatens to remove lawmakers who fled from office.
You got a president who says, okay, I need more Republican seats, so let's just have redistricting, so we can get 5 more Republican seats. That's not what redistricting is for or about. This is something that we do every 10 years based on a census, not based on the president's politics.
LaRose says typically we only see redistricting in the couple of years after the U.S. Census takes place. The last census, taken once each decade, was in 2020.